The arrows fell first, and William Wallace was dead before noon. On September 11th, 1297, the English and Welsh archers of John de Warren's army loosed their volleys across the River Forth, and the Scottish spearmen who should have won Scotland's freedom never reached the field. For decades, the campaign of 1297 had seemed, in our own history, the moment a conquered kingdom learned it could still fight. In this alternate timeline exploration, we examine what could have happened and why the real history unfolded differently. The setting was real and grim. Edward I of England had forced John Balliol to abdicate the Scottish throne in 1296, after the Scots were broken at Dunbar, and he had carried the Stone of Scones south to Westminster. Scotland had bound itself to France in 1295, a mutual pact against England later remembered as the Old Alliance. By 1297, risings against English administration had spread across the country, led in the south by Wallace and in the north by Andrew Moray. Edward himself was campaigning in Flanders that autumn and never saw Stirling. The bridge was the whole problem, and Hugh de Cressingham knew it. The treasurer of Scotland, the hated face of English taxation, resented by Scots and English alike, distrusted the slow, narrow crossing where the wooden span over the Forth could carry only a few men abreast. In our history, Surrey's men crossed piecemeal and were cut apart. Here, Cressingham did not wait. He sent the archers ahead onto the open ground first and ordered them to break the schiltrons before the Scots could charge. It worked with terrible efficiency. The schiltron was a hedgehog of long spears, devastating against cavalry, but almost helpless under massed archery. The Scottish formations stood, and the arrows came, and the formations did not break the English line, they broke themselves. Wallace fell somewhere in that collapse, one body among hundreds in a rout that ended a rebellion before it had truly begun. The Scots had lost a battle. What they did not yet understand was that they had lost the only man who could have made the next one possible. Andrew Moray was the other half of the rising, the leader who had cleared the English from the north, while Wallace held the south. At Stirling in our timeline and in this one, Moray was badly wounded, and he died of those wounds before the year was out. In the history we know, his death still left Wallace standing as guardian of Scotland, a single figure around whom a kingdom could gather. Here there was no such figure left. What remained was resistance without a spine. Local lords held their own glens and their own grievances. The Northern Revolt and the Southern Revolt, never fully one movement, now had no one to bind them together. Robert Bruce, Earl of Carrick, and John Comyn of Badenoch, the two great magnates whose rivalry would have shaped any continued war, circled each other instead of the enemy. Each watched the other. Neither would serve under a rival, and there was no Wallace, no man of no great birth and no faction, to stand above them both. The fighting did not stop. It simply fragmented, region by region, until it was no longer a war for a kingdom, but a scatter of feuds an occupying power could outlast. Edward I returned from Flanders expecting a war. He found a country with no army to give him one. In our history, the king came north in 1298 and met a reformed Scottish host at Falkirk, where his longbowmen tore the schiltrons apart in open battle, the same lesson Cressingham had taught a year early at Stirling. That battle was the proof that Scotland could still field a force worth destroying. In this timeline, there was nothing to destroy. There was no guardian, no national host, no single point where the kingdom's fate could be staked and lost. So Edward did not fight one decisive battle. He conducted a progress. Castle by castle, he moved through Scotland, taking surrenders, accepting submissions, and reducing the strongholds that would not yield. A garrison here, a charter of obedience there. The magnates, with no cause to rally to and no leader to trust, came to terms one after another rather than be ruined alone. Bruce and Comyn among them made their peace, each calculating that accommodation now was wiser than rebellion beside a hated rival. By 1300, it was finished. Not with a victory anyone could name, but with the simple absence of anyone left to resist. Edward did not hold Scotland as a kingdom in suspense. He governed it as a land annexed. This was the deeper change, and it began with a decision about words. In our history, Edward kept treating Scotland as a realm temporarily without a king, a thing that could in principle be restored. Here, with resistance gone 3 years sooner and never revived, he saw no reason for the fiction. English sheriffs were appointed across the shires. English common law was extended northward. English taxation, the very thing Cressingham had embodied, was levied as a matter of routine rather than occupation, and the title itself was allowed to lapse. King of Scots was not abolished by proclamation. It was simply never granted, never claimed, never needed. A generation grew up for whom Scotland was the northern reach of the English crown and had always been so. The Stone of Scone stayed at Westminster, and no one came for it. But the memory of a separate kingdom did not vanish with the title. It went quiet, and what stays quiet can wait. The treaty signed at Paris in 1295 had promised France a friend at England's back. By 1300, that friend did not exist. The old alliance, in the history we know, endured for centuries precisely because Scotland endured. Every time England turned toward France, it had to look over its shoulder at the north. That was the whole strategic value of the bond, a second front England could never quite ignore. With Scotland absorbed into the English crown, the bond became a dead letter. There was no Scottish king to honour it, and no Scottish army to march when France called. Philip IV of France lost something he may not have fully measured at the time. He lost the northern pressure point that had divided English attention for as long as anyone could remember. His successors inherited that loss. When France looked across the Channel in the decades that followed, it saw an island that no longer had to fight two ways at once. When the long quarrel over Gascony and the French succession finally broke into open war, England came to it whole. In our timeline, English kings waged their French wars while bleeding men, money, and attention into the Scottish border, raids, sieges, and the constant cost of a hostile north. Here there was no hostile north. There was only the north, settled and taxed and counted among the king's resources. England drew soldiers and revenue from Scotland the way it drew them from Yorkshire. So Scottish spearmen marched in English armies. Scottish archers, the descendants of men who had once stood in the schiltrons, served the crown that had conquered their grandfathers in fields across France. The manpower that history remembers fighting England now fought beside it. A single island, organized for a single war effort, pressed France harder and from a more secure base than the divided realm of our own past ever managed. What this did to the long war with France, no one in 1300 could have foreseen, but the arithmetic had changed, and arithmetic compounds. 3 centuries before any union our history would recognize, Scotland already existed only as the northern part of an English realm. And yet it was not simply England. Identity does not surrender at a bridge. The lowland nobility, closest to the crown and its rewards, intermarried and assimilated fastest. Careers, lands, and marriages all pointed south, and a family that wished to rise learned to look that way. Within a few generations, the great houses of the Scottish lowlands were difficult to distinguish from the gentry of northern England. The Highlands were another matter. Distance, language, and a different way of holding land kept the north of Scotland at arm's length from English sheriffs and English courts. There, and in the older church with its own saints and its own memory, a distinct sense of being Scottish survived, not as a state which was gone, but as a thing people knew about themselves. It was quieter than a kingdom. It was also harder to conquer, because there was nothing left to besiege. This is the caution the timeline demands. A conquest completed early is not the same as a conquest completed fully. Force can erase a crown. It is far less certain that it can erase a people's account of who they are. Everything turned on a single order, given by a man history barely troubles to remember. Hugh de Cressingham was a treasurer, not a soldier, resented for his taxes, dead in our own timeline within hours of the real battle. In this one, his impatience with a slow crossing did what no king's strategy had managed. It killed Wallace before he could become Wallace. It ended a war of independence before it had a name. It finished Edward's conquest, a quarter-century early, erased the old alliance from the map of European power, and left France to face a single, undivided island. It is worth being careful about what that means. A conquest finished early is not a conquest made right, and nothing here suggests Scotland was better for losing. The old alliance erased is a loss as much as a simplification, a small kingdom's chief shield against a larger neighbor, gone, and the union imposed by force in 1300 is not the union our own history eventually reached by other roads. Whether a thing held together by arrows at a riverbank would have held at all across centuries of highland distance and remembered grievance cannot be known. What can be said is narrower and heavier for it. The schiltrons were always vulnerable to massed archery. At Falkirk in our history, the English proved it a year too late to save Edward the trouble of a long war. At Stirling Bridge, in this one man proved it a year too early, and a kingdom that should have had 3 more centuries simply did not.